In the winter of 2009, every cattle rancher in Custer County, Nebraska, fed their cows the same way. This was not a choice, it was inheritance. Hay in the winter, corn silage in the fall, synthetic minerals in the trough year-round, and a veterinarian bill in the spring that you budgeted for the way you budgeted for property taxes, not because anyone had sat down and decided this was the best system, but because it was the system their fathers had used, and their fathers' fathers before them, and the idea that there might be another way was not a controversial idea. It was not even an idea. It was simply a gap where an idea had never been allowed to form. The Kellerman Ranch sat on 1,800 acres of mixed grass prairie 12 miles northeast of Broken Bow. Edwin Kellerman had built it from 640 acres his grandfather had homesteaded in 1908, adding ground through 3 generations of careful buying and careful living until it was a serious operation. A cow-calf outfit running 280 head of black Angus on ground that had been grazed continuously since before the county had a paved road. Edwin's son, Paul, had taken over the books in 1991 when Edwin's knees gave out and had run it the same way ever since. Continuous grazing, supplemental feed every winter, hay ground irrigated from a pivot on the south quarter. Repeat, year after year, the way the Dismal River ran north before it bent east. Not a decision, a fact. Paul Kellerman was 52 years old in the winter of 2009. He was a methodical man, a man who kept records in a brown 3-ring binder and knew his weaning weights going back 15 years. He had good cattle, and he managed them carefully, and he sent good calves to the sale barn every fall, and he paid his notes, and he coached his youngest son's little league team, and he went to the Lutheran church in Broken Bow on alternating Sundays. He did not ask whether there was a better way to run a cow-calf operation. The way he was running it was working. Barely, some years, but working. His daughter, Megan, was 47 years old in the winter of 2009. And she had just come back to Nebraska. Let me tell you about Megan Kellerman, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is not the kind of character you might expect. She was not young. She was not fresh out of college with a notebook full of research. She was a 47-year-old woman who had spent 22 years as a large animal veterinarian in the Nebraska Sandhills, who had seen the inside of more cows than most people see cows in a lifetime, and who had come back to her father's ranch after her clinic in Ainsworth sold, and her marriage ended in the same calendar year, carrying 2 decades of clinical observation and a conviction about cattle nutrition that the beef industry had not caught up to yet. She came back in November. She stayed in the east bedroom where she had grown up. She helped her father with the winter feeding, and she watched. Let me tell you what Megan saw when she watched, because you need to understand what she understood before you can understand what she proposed. She saw 280 cows grazing the same pastures they had grazed for 30 years. She saw grass that was present but not abundant, grass that was gray-stemmed and brittle at the base, the kind of grass that had been grazed down to the same height every year for so long it had lost the ability to put down deep roots and recover quickly after grazing. She saw soil that crusted between grass clumps in the dry spells, soil that ran off in the wet ones. She saw her father spending $38,000 a year on hay and $11,000 a year on synthetic mineral supplements and $9,000 a year on veterinary costs she knew personally were inflated by nutritional deficiencies the supplements were only partly correcting. She had seen something different in her years of practice. She had a client, a rancher in Garfield County named Walt Perkins, who ran 180 head on 900 acres, who had converted his operation to what he called managed rotational grazing 12 years earlier. Walt moved his cattle through 8 separate paddocks on a rotation that gave each paddock 60 to 90 days of rest between grazing events. He had no hay ground. He had not purchased supplemental minerals in 7 years. His veterinary bills were a third of what comparable operations in the county spent, and his calves weaned 40 pounds heavier than the county average. Megan had watched Walt's grass for a decade. She had watched the root mass deepen. She had watched the soil darken as organic matter built up from the cycle of root growth and dieback that happened when grass was grazed hard and then given time to fully recover. She had watched the bare patches between clumps disappear as the denser sward closed in. She had taken soil samples from Walt's ground and from his neighbor's identical ground, and put them side by side, and the difference in biological activity was not subtle. It was categorical. She brought it up with Paul one evening in February, after supper, when the wind had been cutting out of the northwest for 3 days and neither of them had anywhere to be. She had printed out Walt's grazing records and her own soil sample comparisons, and a summary from a paper published by the University of Nebraska Extension on adaptive multi-paddock grazing results across 40 Sandhills ranches. She set them on the table next to his brown binder and said she wanted to talk about the winter feeding costs. Paul looked at the papers. He looked at his daughter. He said, "What are you getting at?" She explained it the way she had explained animal nutrition 1,000 times to clients who were skeptical, not with condescension, with evidence. She told him about the root depth, about what rest did to grass biology, about how a soil that had been grazed continuously at the same stocking rate year after year was a soil that was running on reserves it could no longer fully replenish. She told him about Walt's operation. She told him that rotational grazing with proper rest intervals would reduce their hay requirement by 60% within 3 years, reduce mineral supplementation by half, improve weaning weights by 30 to 40 pounds per calf. She told him the fencing cost to divide the existing pastures into 8 paddocks was approximately $14,000 in materials. Paul looked at the papers for a long time. "You want to put up new fence," he said. "I want to divide the south pasture first," she said. "Run a pilot on 600 acres. You keep managing the north ground the way you always have. We compare results in 3 years. He picked up the extension summary and looked at it. He set it down. He said, "These are Sandhills ranches. Our ground is different." She said, "Our ground is harder used than most of them, which means it has more room to improve." He thought about it for a week. On the 8th day, he told her she could put up the fencing on the South 600 and run her pilot. He said he would buy the materials. He said if it made the cattle lose condition, they were done. She said that was fair. Let me tell you about what happened at the Custer County Cattlemen's Association meeting in March of 2010, because it is the moment this story pivots, and you need to understand the room. The Cattlemen's Association met on the 3rd Tuesday of every month at the Sandhills Event Center in Broken Bow. It was a room of working ranchers, men and women who ran significant operations and had strong opinions about how significant operations should be run. The man who commanded the most credibility in that room was a fellow named Frank Dowd. Frank ran 600 head on 3,400 acres south of Myrna. He had served 2 terms as county president. He had a white handlebar mustache and a voice that carried without effort, and an opinion about grazing management that he had refined over 40 years and that he had no particular interest in revising. Megan had come to present the pilot plan, not to ask permission, just to present it the way you present something to people who might benefit from knowing about it. She had gotten through about 8 minutes of her presentation, the soil biology section, when Frank Dowd leaned back in his chair and said, without raising his hand, that he had been running cattle on Custer County grass since 1974, and he had never once needed to fence his pastures into chicken wire squares to tell him where to put his cows. The room had a particular quality of quiet after he said that. Megan looked at him. She said, "These aren't chicken wire squares, Frank. They're adaptive paddocks. The sizing changes with rainfall and forage availability." Frank said, "I know what rotational grazing is. I tried it in 1991, and my cows lost 40 pounds by November." She said, "What was your rest period between rotations?" He said, "What?" She said, "How many days did you give each paddock before you came back to it?" He said, "I don't know, 3-4 weeks." She said, "That's the problem. Warm season grasses in this county need 60 to 90 days minimum. 30 days gets you partial recovery. 60 days gets you full recovery, plus root deposit. The difference in soil biology between those two timelines is not incremental, it's categorical. Frank looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has said something that he cannot immediately refute, but has no intention of agreeing with. He said, "You've been a cow doctor, not a rancher." She said, "I've been both for 22 years. The room held its quiet. A woman named Sharon Buell, who ran 200 head near Anselmo, said, "Megan, how long before you'd see a difference in the hay bill?" Megan said, "If the forage responds the way the extension data suggests, meaningfully in year 2, substantially in year 3. Sharon wrote something down. Frank said that he had seen a lot of extension data in his lifetime, and most of it was grown in a research station, not a working ranch. Megan said she agreed with that, and that was why she was running the pilot on her father's ground instead of asking anyone to take her word for it. Frank did not say anything else. He looked at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who has been correct about things for long enough that being possibly incorrect is a physical discomfort. Megan gathered her papers and sat down. She did not argue further. She drove back to the Kellerman ranch and she built her fences. Let me tell you about the fencing because the details matter. Megan divided the south 600 acres into 9 paddocks, using a combination of permanent high-tensile wire on the perimeter and temporary polywire on the interior cross fences that could be moved as forage conditions changed. She installed a single water point at the center accessible from all 9 paddocks using a gravity-fed system off the existing stock tank. The total material cost came to $13,200. She did it herself, and her father did it with her. 3 weeks of post-driving and wire stretching in the early spring before the ground hardened. She stocked the South 600 with 120 head, slightly below the historical stocking rate for that ground, and began moving them on a rotation calibrated to forage height rather than calendar. She did not move the cattle when the calendar said to move them. She moved them when the grass told her to. When the leading paddock had been grazed to a height of 4 inches and the trailing paddock had recovered to 8. She kept a notebook, spiral-bound, college ruled. She recorded entry dates, exit dates, forage height at entry and exit, cattle body condition scores on a 1 to 9 scale, and rainfall. The north ground, Paul's ground, ran 160 head on 1,200 acres the way it always had, same as the year before and the year before that. The first year was not dramatic. The paddock rest intervals gave the grass in the south pasture a recovery it had not had in 30 years, and you could see it by August if you knew what you were looking for. The grass in the trailing paddocks was taller, denser. The bare soil patches between clumps were beginning to close. Megan measured soil temperature in the south paddocks and in the north pasture on the same August afternoon, and the south soil was 6 degrees cooler at 2 inches depth, which meant it was holding moisture. The north ground was evaporating. The cattle did not lose condition. They came through the summer at body condition score 5.8 on average. Paul's north herd came through at 5.6. The difference was small, but the direction was right. The south 120 required 110 round bales of hay through the winter. The north 160 required 210. Adjusted for herd size, the south ground was running at 0.92 bales per cow versus 1.31 bales per cow on the north. Megan wrote that number down and underlined it. Paul did not say anything about expanding the trial, but he helped her repair the polywire after a heifer got through it in December, which was a kind of statement in itself. Let me tell you about the second year, because that is when the numbers became impossible to explain away. Megan came back from a February soil sampling with results that made her sit at the kitchen table for a long time before she said anything. The South 600, after 1 full growing season of managed rotation, had measurably higher earthworm counts, higher microbial activity, and a water infiltration rate of 1.9 inches per hour. She had measured the north ground on the same day. The north ground infiltrated water at 0.7 inches per hour. She wrote that number in the notebook and drew a circle around it. The same circle Claire Halverson had drawn around her coffee can measurements 20 years earlier, on a different piece of ground for a different reason that turned out to be the same reason. In the spring of 2011, Nebraska experienced the wettest April on record in the central Sandhills. Rainfall across Custer County averaged 8 inches in 30 days. On the north ground, Paul lost 40 acres of hay meadow to standing water and erosion on the low edge of the south pivot. On the south 600, the water moved through the soil. There was no standing water. There was no erosion. The cattle grazed through the wet spring without losing days of access to pasture. The difference in forage availability between the two sides of the ranch was visible from the county road. The 2011 fall calves off the south herd weaned at an average of 534 pounds. The north herd weaned at 498 pounds. The difference was 36 pounds per calf. At 1.42 per pound for calves that fall, that was $51.20 per pound for calves that fall, that was $51.20 per calf. Across 120 cows, that was $6,134 additional revenue, plus a hay savings of roughly $4,800 adjusted for herd size, plus the reduction in mineral supplement costs because the south cattle, a more biologically active grass, were showing better coat quality and reproductive rates than the north herd, and Megan had reduced their mineral program accordingly. Paul looked at those numbers in the brown binder alongside Megan's spiral notebook for a while. He said, "What would it cost to fence the rest of it?" She had already done the estimate. She said about $22,000 in materials, 3 weeks of work. He thought about it. He said, "All right. Let me tell you about the summer of 2012, because Nebraska was about to make Megan Kellerman's argument for her in a way that no soil sample or weaning weight ever could. The drought of 2012 was the worst agricultural disaster in the continental United States since the 1980s. It began in the spring with soil moisture deficits across the entire Great Plains and escalated through June and July into a catastrophe. The jet stream locked into a blocking pattern that held heat over the Corn Belt, and the cattle country of the Sandhills baked under temperatures that broke records set during the Dust Bowl. Pastures turned from green to yellow to the pale tan of forage that has run out of water and stopped growing. The USDA Drought Monitor classified most of Custer County as D3, extreme drought, by the first week of July. Ranchers across the county faced a choice they had not had to face in decades. They could hold their herds and buy expensive hay from states that still had moisture at prices that ran as high as $280 per ton, or they could liquidate part of their herd at distressed prices into a market where everyone was selling at once. Frank Dowd sold 180 head in July and August, a third of his operation, to reduce his feed requirement. He was not the only one. The sale barn and Broken Bow ran 3 extra days in August and still had cattle backed up. The Kellerman Ranch South 600, which had now had 3 full growing seasons of managed rotational grazing, was doing something that the neighbors driving the county road were stopping to look at. Not doing well. Let me be clear about that. 2012 was not a good year for anyone in Custer County, but the South Round was doing differently. The water infiltration rate that Megan had been documenting, 1.9 inches per hour against the north ground 0.7, meant that the 2 inches of rain that fell in late June, the last meaningful rain the county would see until September, had penetrated the south paddocks to a depth of 14 inches. The same rain had run off the north ground and most of the surrounding ranches, wetting the top 4 inches and evaporating within a week. The organic matter that had been building in the South 600 for 3 seasons was holding that 14-inch moisture profile in the root zone, while the surrounding pastures went dry at 6 inches. The grass in the south paddock stopped growing in July the way all the grass stopped growing, but the root depth and the soil moisture meant it did not die. It went dormant. It held its structure, and when Megan moved the cattle off the south ground in August to give it complete rest through the drought, the grass crown was intact, waiting. The South 120 required 340 round bales through the fall and winter of 2012 into 2013. At $85 per bale, that was $28,900. It was a hard year, but the herd came through intact. Every cow, every calf. Body condition scores at weaning averaged 5.2, down from 5.8, but acceptable. Reproductive rates for the following year were not significantly impacted. Frank Dowd's remaining 420 head required feed costs. He later described, at the following March cattlemen's meeting, as the worst winter of his professional life. He did not give a number. The number his banker gave him was different from the number he gave him was different from the number he gave the association. Several ranches in the county that had been marginal before 2012 did not survive 2013. Megan's South calves weaned at 511 pounds in the fall of 2012 in the drought off the managed rotation ground. The county average that fall was 441. The difference was 70 pounds per calf. She wrote all of this in the notebook. She did the math on a separate page. The South herd, managed rotationally through the worst drought in 30 years, had outperformed the county average by 70 pounds per calf in the year that everyone else was deciding whether their operation would survive. Paul sat at the kitchen table that November with his brown binder open and Megan's spiral notebook beside it, the two records side by side, covering 3 years of every measurement she had taken. He read through it slowly. She let him. She was sitting across from him drinking coffee, and she did not say anything until he looked up. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You don't." He said, "I gave you the South 600 like it was something I could afford to lose, the harder ground, the ground that had been the problem pasture for 20 years because it never responded the way the North ground did." She said, "The South 600 is why we have the data." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean." She understood what he meant. He closed the binder and said, "You want to put up the talk at the cattleman's next month?" She said yes. He said, "I'll come with you." Let me tell you about the March 2013 Cattlemen's Association meeting because it is the moment this story has been moving toward since that first evening in February when she put the papers on the table. The room was different than it had been in 2010. Some of the faces were the same. Some were not. 2012 had a way of changing the population of a room like that, quietly, in ways you noticed only when you looked for the people who weren't there anymore. Megan stood at the front with 3 years of grazing records, 3 years of soil tests, 3 years of weaning weights and hay consumption figures and body condition scores. She presented it the way she had learned to present clinical findings after 20 years of working with skeptical ranchers, not triumphantly, methodically. She showed the infiltration rate comparison. She showed the 2012 drought data. She showed the hay cost per cow over 3 years, dropping from 1.31 bales to 0.61 bales on the managed rotation ground. Sharon Buell asked 3 questions and wrote down every answer. A rancher from near Arnold named Dennis Holt asked whether the polywire fencing held up to bulls. Megan said it held up to her bulls, and she would tell him exactly what gauge she used. She was halfway through the weaning weight comparison when Frank Dowd raised his hand, not speaking over her this time, raising his hand. She paused and looked at him. He said, "I sold 180 head last August. I'm down to 420 cows on ground. I've run 600 on my whole career, and I'm not sure I can build back up at current hay prices." The room was quiet. He said, "What would it cost me, in materials, to put in your system on my South pastures?" Megan looked at Frank Dowd for a moment. He was 67 years old, and he had been certain about cattle for 45 years, and the certainty had cost him 180 head in the worst drought of his career, and he was sitting in a folding chair in the Sandhills Event Center asking a cow doctor from the east bedroom of the Kellerman ranch how to fix his ground. She did not point any of that out. She said, "I'll come walk your ground with you before the grass comes up, and we'll figure out what you need." Frank nodded. He said, "I'd appreciate that." The room was quiet for another moment, and then Sharon Buell started asking about the portable water system, and the meeting turned practical, and Megan answered every question until the room ran out of questions. Paul was in the second row. When she gathered her papers to leave, he was standing. He was not a man who stood at things. A couple of other ranchers stood with him, and then a few more, and Megan looked out at her father standing in the second row with his hands at his sides, not making a performance of it, just standing. And she knew exactly what it cost him to stand in a room of his peers and make that statement without saying a word. Let me tell you what happened in the years after, because the story does not end in March of 2013. By 2015, 11 ranches in Custer County had implemented some version of the rotational grazing system Megan had documented on the Kellerman South ground. By 2018, that number was 26, operating across a combined 47,000 acres of Sandhills pasture. The results were not uniform. Managed grazing is not a formula. It is an observation practice, a commitment to watching your ground and responding to what it shows you, rather than doing what you did last year, because you did it last year. But the direction was consistent across every ranch that committed to the rest intervals and the record keeping. Organic matter was building. Water infiltration was improving. Hay requirements were falling. In the dry summers that came after 2012, which were several, the ranches with established rotation programs were losing less ground, holding more cows, and selling heavier calves than their neighbors. Frank Dowd rebuilt his herd to 560 head by 2017. He gave Megan credit for it publicly at the cattlemen's meeting in November of that year, in a room that included 30 ranchers who had not been in the 2010 meeting and did not know the history. He said she had shown him something he should have been willing to learn in 2010, and that the years between were the most expensive education of his career. He said it without self-pity, the way a man states a fact he has made peace with. Megan finished building out the Kellerman rotation system by 2014. She took over full management of the ranch when Paul's back made the daily work too difficult. She expanded the herd to 340 head across the full 1,800 acres and reduced the total hay budget below what Paul had spent feeding 280 head on continuous grazing in 2009. The anhydrous equivalent of that operation, the external inputs it had required to maintain production on degraded ground, had been replaced by something the ground was producing itself. In 2019, her nephew Marcus, her brother's son, finished his animal science degree at the University of Nebraska and came to the ranch for the summer. He was 22 years old and he had taken a precision agriculture course that included remote sensing analysis of pasture biomass, and he came in one evening with his laptop and a set of drone imagery overlaid with normalized difference vegetation index maps of the ranch, and he said, "Aunt Megan, I want to show you something." She looked at the screen. The South 600 lit up and deep green. The north ground, which they had only finished converting to full rotation in 2016, was a lighter shade but trending the same direction. The map showed what 8 years of rest and root deposit had done to the plant density of that pasture in a way that was impossible to see from the ground, but obvious from 400 feet in the air. Marcus said, "I want to run a trial on the hay meadow. There's research out of South Dakota State on integrating cover crops into irrigated meadow systems that I think could cut the pivot costs by 40%. Megan looked at the screen. She looked at her nephew. She said, "How much ground do you need?" He said, "I'd like to start with the east pivot." She said, "The east pivot is yours." That is what the notebook was for. Not only to record what worked, but to hold the shape of what it felt like when nobody thought it would, so that when the next person came in with something new and unproven and quietly right, you did not make them earn the acreage they needed. You just handed it over and let them work. The Kellerman Ranch is still there, northeast of Broken Bow. The organic matter in the South pastures now averages above 3.8%. A number the local NRCS range conservationist uses in presentations to ranchers who are still running their ground the old way. The hay meadow pivot that Marcus took on in 2019 is producing results that will be the subject of an entirely different story. Frank Dowd's ranch is running 580 head on ground that nearly broke him in 2012, and if you drive his county road in July on a good year, you can see the difference in the grass from the cab of a truck. The spiral-bound notebook with 3 years of Custer County grazing data is in the kitchen drawer next to Paul's brown binder. Both of them are full. She came back to a broken ranch in a hard winter, and she told them the grass already knew how to heal itself. They laughed. The drought came. The cows went to town. The Kellerman ground held. I keep thinking about what Megan said at that cattlemen's meeting, not the yield numbers, not the infiltration rates, the part where she told Frank Dowd without any trace of satisfaction in her voice that she would come walk his ground with him before the grass came up, that she would help him figure out what he needed, after everything he had said to her in that room 3 years earlier. That is the detail I cannot stop returning to. There is a version of this story where Megan uses 2012 as a weapon, where she sits across from Frank at that March meeting and lets the numbers do the damage they were capable of doing. She had earned that. Every inch of it. She came back to her father's ranch with 22 years of clinical knowledge that nobody in Custer County wanted to hear, and she built her case in silence on the hardest pasture they had. And then a drought came and proved every number she had written down, and she could have stood at that podium and made Frank Dowd very small. She chose not to. I think about why. It was not weakness. A woman who comes back to a broken operation in a Nebraska winter and spends 3 weeks driving fence posts by herself is not a woman who lacks for resolve. It was something more deliberate than that. It was the understanding that being right is only useful if the right thing spreads, that if she made Frank Dowd feel ashamed in front of his peers, the ranchers sitting next to him would remember that feeling before they remembered her infiltration rates, that the ground she was trying to heal was not just the 600 acres south of the Kellerman barn. It was all of it, every overgrazed pasture in the county. And you do not heal ground by humiliating the people who are standing on it. That is what I mean when I say that how you carry knowledge matters as much as whether you have it. Megan had the knowledge. She had earned it across 2 decades of large animal practice, across 3 years of soil sampling with her own hands, across every wet April measurement and every drought year weaning weight she had recorded in that spiral-bound notebook. The intellectual work was real, and it was painstaking, and it required the kind of sustained curiosity that most people abandon when the first year of data does not produce a dramatic result. She did not abandon it. She kept measuring. She kept adjusting the rest intervals. She kept walking the paddocks when the forage told her something she had not expected. But the knowledge alone would not have changed 47,000 acres of Custer County grassland. What changed those acres was the decision she made standing at the front of that room, to respond to a man who had publicly dismissed her with an offer to help him, instead of a case against him. That decision required something beyond intelligence. It required a settled sense of who she was and what she was actually trying to accomplish, not vindication, recovery, for the ground, for the ranches, for the people who were one bad drought from losing what their grandparents had built. Paul stood up in that meeting without saying a word. He understood what his daughter had just done, and he understood what it had cost her, and standing was the only language he had for it. The notebook is in the kitchen drawer next to his brown binder. Both of them are full. That is not a small thing. That is what happens when someone decides that the work matters more than the credit for the work. I have met very few people in my life who are capable of making that decision consistently, under pressure, in a room full of people waiting to see which way they go. Megan Kellerman was one of them. The grass grew back because she was.